What would you do if on the worst day of your life you received a key capable of changing everything? Harold Jensen never imagined that his dismissal would become the beginning of something much bigger and much darker than he could have imagined. It was an ordinary Monday in Cleveland, Ohio, when Harold walked into Whitmore Industrial for the last time. 34 years. More than 3 decades waking before sunrise, cleaning hallways, emptying trash cans, fixing what nobody else wanted to fix. To the company, he was just another number on the payroll, invisible, disposable. And that day at 61, Harold held in his hands a cold, unexplained, unannounced letter of dismissal, just a cardboard box and a perfunctory handshake, or at least that's what was supposed to happen. But then the manager did something completely unexpected. With a strange smile, the kind that sends a chill down your spine, he handed Harold a rusty key. It wasn't just any key. It was the key to the abandoned basement storage room, that mysterious place no one had opened in decades, shrouded in legends and whispered rumors among the oldest employees. "You can keep whatever you find in there," the man said, almost as if he were getting rid of a burden. Harold stared at the key, confused, not understanding what it meant. Why him? Why now? Have you ever been there? That moment when something seems wrong, but you still can't quite put your finger on what it is. Stick with me until the end, because what Harold found in that dark, dusty warehouse wasn't just forgotten corporate junk. That night, alone among old boxes, yellowed documents, and secrets locked away for decades, Harold Jensen discovered something that would shake the entire company, a truth so disturbing it should never have come to light. And from that moment on, his simple, invisible life would never be the same. What you're about to discover might surprise you and make you wonder how many truths are still hidden in places no one dares to open. Harold was about to open the door, and on the other side, a conspiracy that would change everything. Before we continue with this story that will leave you speechless, I need to tell you something. If you're feeling that tightness in your chest, that curiosity that won't let you stop watching, then this content was made exactly for you. And do you know what motivates me to keep bringing you real stories like this? Stories that move us, that make us reflect on courage, justice, and truth. It's knowing that there are people on the other side, you who care about this as much as I do. So if this story is touching you in any way, leave a comment below about what has impacted you the most so far. Have you ever been through a similar situation? Have you ever felt like you were being treated as invisible? Or do you know someone who had the courage to face something much bigger than themselves? I read all the comments, truly, and each story shared here creates a community of people who believe that the truth should always come to light. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content that transforms, that moves, that makes us believe that there are still heroes in the world, even if they are simple janitors with a rusty key in their hand. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Click the subscribe button and activate the bell, because I guarantee you won't want to miss the next stories. I've prepared. Every like you leave below shows me that this work is worthwhile, that there are people willing to listen, to feel, to connect with real stories that deserve to be told. So go ahead, leave a like, subscribe, comment, and let's go together until the end of this journey. Now let's go back to Harold, because what he was about to discover in that dark warehouse went beyond anything he or we could have imagined. To understand the weight of what happened that day, you need to know who Harold Jensen really was. Not the Harold the company saw, or rather didn't see, but the man behind the faded blue uniform and the squeaky cleaning cart that creaked through the hallways. Harold was always the kind of person who went unnoticed. You know, that employee who's there every day doing his job quietly, without complaining, without asking for recognition? That was him. Every day, religiously, at 5 in the morning, Harold parked his old pickup truck in front of Whitmore Industrial, an electronics components factory in the heart of Cleveland, Ohio. While the city was still asleep, he was already up, sweeping the hallways, cleaning the bathrooms, fixing small leaks that no one else bothered to notice. 34 years doing the same thing. 34 years knowing every corner of that building better than the directors themselves who occupied the offices on the top floor. Harold knew where the pipes leaked in the winter, which door creaked the loudest, where the light flickered before burning out. He knew the inner workings of that company like no one else, but to them, to the executives in suits who passed him without even a good morning, Harold was invisible. Just another cog in the machine, easily replaceable, disposable. And perhaps that was precisely why Harold never complained. At 61, widowed for almost a decade, with no children, no close family, that job was all he had. It wasn't glamorous, it didn't pay well, but it was his. It was his routine, his identity, the place where he belonged. Until one day, without warning, without any consideration for his years of dedication, the company decided to cut costs. The transformation came from the top down, cold and calculated, like all corporate decisions, outsourcing the cleaning. Cheaper, more efficient, less commitment to real people. Harold was let go on a Monday. No farewell party, no commemorative plaque, not even an email thanking him for his years of service. Just a curt letter, informing him that his services were no longer needed, and a cardboard box to take his few belongings. A mug, a spare coat, a framed photo of his wife who was no longer here. And then, just when Harold thought that was it, the silent end of an invisible journey, the manager did it. He handed over the key, that rusty key to the abandoned basement storage room, with a strange smile and a phrase that would echo in Harold's mind for days. You can keep whatever you find inside. Why him? Why at that particular moment? Harold held the cold key in his calloused hand and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity mixed with a chill down his spine. Something about that gesture wasn't right. Something about that decision concealed a hidden truth that still needed to come to light. And Harold, holding that key, was about to open a door that would change not only his life, but the lives of hundreds of people he would never know. That same night, Harold returned to the factory, not as an employee, but as someone who had one last mission to accomplish, even without knowing exactly what it was. The building was empty, silent, with only the emergency lights flickering in the corridors he knew so well. His footsteps echoed as he descended the stairs to the basement, a place that always had a different, heavier atmosphere, as if the air there held secrets that time had tried to erase. And then he saw it, the metal door at the end of the corridor, the forbidden storage room. Among the long-time employees, that place was almost an urban legend. There were whispered rumors during coffee breaks, half-told stories that never had a clear ending. They said the warehouse was closed in the 80s, shortly after an incident that nobody liked to talk about. Some spoke of an accident, others of something the company wanted to hide. But over time, the stories became more vague, until that place became just another locked door that everyone saw, but nobody questioned. The door was covered in rust, worn down by decades of neglect, and a thick, heavy padlock kept it sealed as if it were a safe guarding something too valuable or too dangerous to be accessed. Harold stopped in front of that door and hesitated. His hand trembled as he gripped the key. Part of him simply wanted to leave, forget everything, move on with his life. But another part, that inner voice he couldn't ignore, whispered questions that wouldn't leave his head. Why would the manager give him access to this particular place? Why now? Why him? It didn't make sense unless there was a hidden reason, a truth that needed to be discovered. And Harold, even though he was afraid, knew he had to open that door. The key turned with difficulty in the rusty lock. The padlock gave way with a dull click. Harold pushed the metal door, and it creaked like an ancient scream, as if being violated after years of silence. A wave of cold, musty air hit his face, carrying the unmistakable smell of old paper, accumulated dust and something else, something he couldn't identify but which sent shivers down his spine. He turned on his cell phone's flashlight and illuminated the interior. What he saw, at first glance, seemed disappointing. Piles and piles of cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly, old dusty files, broken office furniture, chairs without seats, desks with open and empty drawers. It looked like just forgotten corporate waste, the kind of thing companies accumulate over the years and never have the courage to throw away. But Harold wasn't the type to give up easily. 34 years cleaning that place had taught him one thing: what goes on behind the scenes always reveals more than what's on the surface. He had plenty of time now. Nowhere to be in the morning, no pressing responsibilities, and something inside him, that intuition you feel when you're about to discover something important, clearly told him, look harder. Don't accept the obvious. Go deeper. Because the transformation that was about to happen in Harold's life wouldn't come from what was visible at first glance, but from what was hidden in the deepest layers of that room, forgotten by time. Then he went inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a heavy bang, and Harold began rummaging through those boxes one by one, driven by a curiosity that grew stronger with each passing minute. And if you've made it this far with me, then you also feel that need to find out what comes next. If this journey is making sense to you, subscribe to the channel now, because you're as much a part of this story as Harold is. You're not just watching, you're witnessing a revelation that's about to change everything. And it was in one of those boxes, hidden behind a fallen shelf, that Harold found something that would make his heart race. For 3 whole days, Harold returned to that warehouse. He didn't tell anyone. He had no one to tell anyway. He simply went there every night, after the new cleaning crew's shift ended, and searched the place like a detective obsessed with a clue he didn't yet know he was looking for. He opened box after box, leafed through old documents, production reports from the 70s and 80s, inventory spreadsheets, receipts yellowed with age. Most of it was irrelevant, just forgotten paperwork. But Harold didn't give up. His intuition, that inner voice that had brought him there, kept whispering, keep looking. And then, on the 3rd day, when he was beginning to question whether he was wasting his time, Harold moved a metal shelf that had fallen years before, leaning against the back wall. And there, hidden as if someone had deliberately tried to conceal it, was a box unlike any other. It wasn't an ordinary box of worn cardboard. This one was sealed with industrial tape, several layers, as if someone wanted to be absolutely certain that no one would ever open it. And on top, in large red letters, a stamp that made Harold's heart race. Confidential, 1983. His hands trembled as he picked up the box. Its weight was significant, not just physically, but symbolically. He knew, somehow inexplicably, that what was inside would change everything. Carefully, Harold tore the tape, battling decades of dried glue, until he finally managed to open it. The smell of old paper filled his nostrils, and then he saw dozens of meticulously organized folders, each labeled with names, dates, and codes he didn't understand at first glance. But as he began to open the folders one by one, the hidden truth began to reveal itself before his eyes like a macabre puzzle. Medical reports, blood tests with abnormal results highlighted in yellow, contamination reports signed by doctors he had never heard of. And then, at the bottom of the box, a list typed on Whitmore industrial letterhead, a list that would send a chill down anyone's spine. 47 names, 47 employees who worked on the production line between 1978 and 1983. And, next to each name, handwritten notes in faded blue pen: leukemia, lung cancer, liver cancer, deceased in 1984, deceased in 1987, deceased in 1990. Page after page of names followed by devastating diagnoses and dates of death. Harold held that list with trembling hands and felt his legs weaken, because he knew some of those names. They weren't just numbers or statistics on a piece of paper. They were real people. They were colleagues he had seen in the hallways, with whom he had exchanged greetings, who had families, dreams, entire lives ahead of them. Miguel Rodriguez. Harold remembered him. A young, always smiling guy who worked on the assembly line and died of leukemia at 32. At the time, everyone said it was bad luck, bad genetics. Sandra Mitchell. She was pregnant when she got sick, lost the baby, died 3 years later. Natural causes, they said. Thomas O'Brien. Lung cancer, and he'd never smoked a cigarette in his life. They were all on that list. They all worked on the same production line during the same years. And they all died too young, from illnesses that Harold was now beginning to understand were not coincidences. This revelation hit him like a punch to the gut. The transformation in Harold's mindset was instantaneous. He was no longer just holding old documents. He was holding evidence of something much bigger, much more sinister. And the impact of this discovery wasn't just personal, it was monumental. Harold closed his eyes and took a deep breath. And then, with his hands still trembling, he continued reading. Because what came next was even worse. As Harold delved deeper into those files, the truth unfolded before him like a nightmare in slow motion. Each document he opened, each internal memo he read, each technical report he flipped through, built a narrative so disturbing that he had to stop several times just to process what he was seeing. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't accidental negligence. It was something far more calculated, far more cruel. It was a conscious corporate decision that prioritized profit over human lives. Throughout the 1980s, Whitmore Industrial used a chemical called trichloroethylene in the manufacture of electronic circuits. Harold had never heard of this substance before, but the documents explained everything in cold, clinical, technical detail. Trichloroethylene was cheap, extremely efficient at cleaning electronic components, and therefore widely used in industry. The problem? It was also extremely toxic. Prolonged exposure to its fumes caused irreversible damage to the liver, kidneys, and central nervous system, and it was directly linked to the development of various types of cancer, especially leukemia and lung cancer. And here's the part that made Harold nauseous. The company knew. They were fully aware of the risks. There were internal memos dated 1979, signed by the directors themselves, acknowledging that trichloroethylene posed a health risk to workers. There were studies commissioned by Whitmore itself that confirmed the urgent need to install adequate ventilation systems, personal protective equipment, and constant monitoring of air quality inside the factory. But do you know what they did with these recommendations? They filed them away, they ignored them. Because implementing these safety measures would cost, according to a spreadsheet Harold found, approximately $300,000. And the board decided that $300,000 was too much money to spend on the safety of their own employees, so they simply continued using the product without any kind of adequate protection, fully aware of the risks, while dozens of workers breathed those toxic fumes day after day, shift after shift, year after year. And when employees started getting sick, because it was inevitable that they would, the company took no responsibility. Instead, they doubled down on concealment. Harold found payment receipts made to specific doctors, professionals who were paid under the table to falsify medical reports, to classify cancer cases as genetic coincidences or causes unrelated to the work environment. There were even letters from lawyers instructing the doctors on exactly what to write in the reports to protect the company from labor lawsuits. And for the families who dared to question, who began to ask inconvenient questions about why so many workers on the same production line were dying from the same diseases, the company had a clear strategy: silence them with money, confidentiality agreements, small settlements, usually between $10,000 and $20,000, offered to desperate widows, to parents who had just lost young children, to families devastated by grief and medical bills. And in exchange for this money, they had to sign documents promising never to speak publicly about the case, never to sue the company, never to seek justice. Everything was hushed up, systematically, coldly. And those documents, the only real evidence of what had happened, were locked away in that underground warehouse, never to see the light of day again. Harold sat on the cold floor of that warehouse, surrounded by stacks of papers containing the truth about one of the biggest corporate betrayals he had ever witnessed. And he realized something fundamental. He hadn't stumbled upon those documents by accident. Someone had put them there. Someone knew that one day they would be found. And now, decades later, they were in his hands. The question hammering in Harold's mind was simple but weighty. What do I do with this? If you're feeling the weight of this decision as much as Harold, then subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will show you the true meaning of courage. And at that moment, alone in the dark, Harold Jensen had to make the most important decision of his life. Harold spent the entire night unable to sleep. lying on the bed in his small Cleveland apartment, staring at the cracked ceiling illuminated by the orange light of the street lamp. He held those documents against his chest as if they were a bomb about to explode. And in a way, they were exactly that. Pure dynamite. He knew that what he held in his hands was not just old paper and faded ink. It was power. It was truth. It was justice waiting to happen. But it was also danger. Real, concrete danger, the kind that could destroy the life of an ordinary man like him. If Harold made it public, Whitmore Industrial would be destroyed. He had no doubt about it. Lawsuits would rain down on the company like an avalanche. Millions of dollars would have to be paid to the victims' families. Executives would go to prison. The company's reputation, built over decades, would be demolished overnight. And part of Harold, that weary part, that part that just wanted peace after years of invisibility, felt a strange satisfaction with this idea. But there was a problem. He also knew he could become a target. Whitmore Industrial was still powerful, very powerful. They had expensive lawyers, the kind who earn millions to make problems disappear. They had political connections in Cleveland, Ohio, maybe even Washington. They had unlimited resources to silence anyone who tried to expose their secrets. And who was Harold against all that? A 61-year-old retired janitor, alone, no family, no financial resources, no protection. If he decided to go ahead with this, he would be declaring war on a giant that could crush him without even blinking. Lawsuits for defamation, intimidation, threats. Harold knew all of that was possible, and the fear was real. The fear of losing what little he still had, of having his name dragged through the mud, of ending his days as a paranoid old man living in fear of shadows. Part of him, a considerable part, just wanted to throw it all away. Burn the documents, pretend he'd never found them, move on with his simple, safe life, get a part-time job somewhere, live out his retirement in silence, die peacefully without complications. It would be so easy, so safe, so cowardly. Because deep down, Harold knew this wasn't just a decision about him. It was a decision about all those people whose names were on that list, people who no longer had a voice, people who had been betrayed, poisoned, silenced, and forgotten. And then, in the middle of that sleepless night, as the clock struck 3 in the morning, Harold closed his eyes and remembered. He remembered Miguel Rodriguez's face, a young Mexican man full of life who had come to the United States in search of a better future. Miguel worked on the production line, always with a smile on his face, always telling funny stories during his breaks. Harold remembered how Miguel talked about his young daughter who was growing up, how he saved every penny to give her a better education than he had. And then, out of nowhere, Miguel began to lose weight, to become tired, missing work. Leukemia, the doctors said. Aggressive. At 35, Miguel was dead, and his daughter grew up without a father, without knowing that he had been slowly murdered by a company that chose profit over safety. Harold remembered Sandra Mitchell, a sweet woman who worked in administration but frequently visited the production line. Sandra was pregnant, radiant, planning her future with her husband. And then she began to feel pain, pregnancy complications. She lost the baby in the 6th month. 3 years later, she was also dead, cancer. She never knew why. She never had the chance to understand that it wasn't bad luck, it wasn't fate, it wasn't God's will. It was corporate negligence, disguised as cost-cutting. At that moment, Harold realized something fundamental that completely changed his mindset. He was the only one who could give them a voice now. If he did nothing, those 47 people would die a second time, this time in complete oblivion, their stories buried forever, along with the documents in that storage room. But if he had courage, if he chose to do the right thing even with fear, even alone, even knowing the risks, then perhaps, just perhaps, their deaths would not have been in vain. Harold opened his eyes, and for the first time in days, he knew exactly what he needed to do. But Harold wasn't stupid. 34 years working behind the scenes at a company had taught him a valuable lesson. Never underestimate the power of those in charge, and never go into battle alone when you can find allies. He knew that if he simply showed up with those documents, knocking on the door of any newspaper or impulsively posting everything on social media, Whitmore Industrial would have the time and resources to cover it all up before the truth really came out. He needed help, professional help, someone who knew how to navigate the complicated world of media, justice, and public opinion. It was then that Harold remembered a story he'd read a few months earlier in the Cleveland Tribune. An investigative series about corporate negligence in factories in the region, exposing how companies put workers at risk to save money. The article had been powerful, well-researched, and had resulted in real change. The journalist's name was etched in his memory, Jennifer Ortiz, a young woman perhaps in her 30s, with a growing reputation for not being afraid to confront the powerful. Harold picked up the phone with trembling hands and called the newspaper's newsroom. 2 hours later, he was sitting in a small cafe in downtown Cleveland, a briefcase full of documents on the table, waiting. When Jennifer arrived, Harold immediately knew he had made the right choice. She wasn't the type to waste time on formalities. She sat down, ordered a coffee, and got straight to the point. "You said you have evidence of corporate negligence that resulted in deaths. Show it." Harold opened the folder and began to show her the medical reports, the list of 47 names, the internal memos, acknowledging the risks of trichloroethylene, the payment receipts for doctors, the confidentiality agreements. As Jennifer flipped through those documents, her face changed from professional skepticism to genuine shock. She stopped drinking her coffee. She stopped taking notes. She just read page after page, her eyes wide. When she finally looked up at Harold, there was something different in her expression. It wasn't just journalistic interest. It was indignation. It was the kind of fire that moves people to do the right thing even when it's difficult. "Harold, this is journalistic gold," she said, her voice firm but heavy with emotion. "This is one of the biggest corporate negligence stories I've ever seen. But you need to understand one thing. This is also extremely dangerous. Whitmore Industrial will come after you with everything they've got. They'll try to destroy your credibility, intimidate you, maybe even sue you for defamation or theft of confidential documents. Are you really prepared for that?" Harold looked her in the eye and without hesitation nodded. "I have nothing left to lose, but those people on the list, they've lost everything. I need to do this for them." From that moment on, Harold was no longer alone. Jennifer became not only his ally but his strategist. Together they devised a meticulous plan. First, they digitized every page, every report, every name, every document. They created digital copies in multiple formats and stored them on different cloud services, flash drives, and external hard drives. They distributed physical copies in secure locations, at Jennifer's house with a trusted lawyer, in a bank vault. The idea was simple. Even if Whitmore tried to destroy the evidence or intimidate Harold, the truth would already be protected in so many places that it would be impossible to erase it. Jennifer also knew that a news report alone wouldn't be enough. They needed legal weight. So she contacted lawyers specializing in class action lawsuits, professionals who dedicated their careers to fighting large corporations on behalf of injured workers. 2 law firms agreed to review the documents and, after confirming the validity of the evidence, agreed to represent the victims' families in a massive class action lawsuit against Whitmore Industrial. Within 2 weeks, they had much more than documents. They had a complete action plan, a solid legal strategy, a powerful journalistic narrative, and the perfect timing to launch it all at once so that the impact would be inescapable. The bomb was about to explode, and this time there was no way the company could cover up the truth. If you're feeling the tension rising, if you're rooting for Harold and Jennifer to get justice, then subscribe to the channel, because what comes next will show you the power of when courageous people unite for a greater cause. And on a Tuesday morning, everything changed. At 6 o'clock in the morning, when most people in Cleveland were still having breakfast, the digital edition of the Cleveland Tribune published the story. The headline filled the screen in large, unmissable letters. Cleveland Company concealed worker poisoning for 40 years. Below it was an old photo of Whitmore Industrial in the 1980s, showing workers entering the factory unaware of the danger that awaited them every day. Jennifer Ortiz's report was over 5,000 words long, meticulously detailed, with digitized documents, interviews with occupational health experts and, most importantly, the complete list of the 47 victims' names, each with their story told with dignity and respect. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. In less than 2 hours, the story had thousands of shares on social media. By 9 in the morning, Cleveland's major television stations were already replicating the news. By noon, national networks like CNN, NBC, and ABC had teams on their way to the city to cover the scandal. What Jennifer and Harold had done wasn't just a local story. It was a journalistic bombshell exploding on a national scale. People across the country began sharing the story, outraged by the cruelty and corporate greed it revealed. Hashtags like "Justice for Whitmore" and "Never Again" began appearing everywhere. And then something even more powerful began to happen. Families of former Whitmore industrial employees, many of whom had lived for decades believing their loved ones had died by bad luck or natural causes, began to speak out. Widows, children, siblings, all sharing their stories of grief, of unexplained loss, of questions that had never been answered. My father worked at Whitmore for 15 years and died of leukemia at 42. The doctors said it was genetic, but no one in our family had a history of cancer. Now I know the truth, one woman wrote on Twitter. My mother lost 3 babies during the years she worked there. She never understood why. I never had siblings because of it. Another person commented on Facebook. Story after story, each adding more fuel to the public outrage that grew like an unstoppable wave. The pressure became unbearable for Whitmore Industrial. Within 48 hours, the company's CEO resigned. The board of directors issued a vague and defensive statement, denying any prior knowledge of the risks, blaming previous management and different safety standards at the time. But nobody was buying that narrative. The documents Harold had found were too clear, too specific, signed by people who were still alive and who would now have to answer for their decisions. The company's stock plummeted 52% in a single week. Investors fled like rats, abandoning a sinking ship. Government contracts were cancelled. Whitmore Industrial's reputation, built over decades, was being demolished in real time. And then the authorities stepped in. The U.S. Department of Justice announced the opening of a full criminal investigation, focusing on fraud, criminal negligence, and conspiracy to conceal evidence. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, intervened to assess whether there was any remaining contamination at the factory facilities and in the surrounding soil, endangering the local community. Ohio state prosecutors began preparing charges against individual executives. The machinery of justice, which for decades had been blocked by money and influence, finally began to turn. And at the center of it all, responsible for triggering this monumental transformation, was Harold Jensen. The invisible janitor, the man no one noticed, who had been dismissed as irrelevant, had become the unlikely hero who exposed one of the biggest corporate frauds in Ohio history. Journalists knocked on his door wanting to interview him. Television programs invited him to appear. People on the streets recognized him and stopped him to thank him, some with tears in their eyes. Harold, who had spent his entire life cleaning hallways while others received the applause, was now being seen, truly seen for the first time. But Harold knew that the real victory was yet to come, because exposing the truth was only the first step. Now it was time to ensure that justice was done. And justice, though slow, finally arrived. 18 months after that Tuesday that changed everything, Harold sat on a wooden bench in the Cleveland federal courthouse, watching the judge bang the gavel for the last time. Whitmore Industrial, the company that had dominated the local economy for decades, that had employed thousands of people, that had presented itself as a pillar of the community, was officially closing its doors. Complete bankruptcy. Not for lack of market or technological changes, but for its own cruel decisions that had finally exacted their due price. The lawsuits, the criminal investigations, the astronomical EPA fines, and above all the total loss of public trust, had made it impossible for the company to continue operating. And Harold, sitting there in silence, felt a mixture of sadness for the community that would lose jobs and satisfaction in knowing that the truth had prevailed. But the company's closure was only part of the story. What truly mattered, what Harold had fought to achieve from the beginning, was holding accountable the people who had made those fatal decisions decades earlier. And in that courtroom, over months of trials that had captured national attention, the executives responsible for the decision to use trichloroethylene without adequate protection were one by one convicted. Prison sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years for criminal negligence, conspiracy to conceal evidence, fraud, and manslaughter. Men who had spent their lives in luxurious offices, making decisions that affected other people's lives as if they were just numbers on spreadsheets, would now have to face the real consequences of their choices. The transformation was complete, from untouchables to convicts. And then came the compensation. After intense negotiations between the victims' lawyers and the representatives of the bankrupt company's creditors, a compensation fund of $340 million was created. $340 million. It was an impossible number for Harold, who had lived his entire life on modest wages, to process. But for the victims' families, that money represented much more than numbers. It represented recognition. It represented the public admission that their losses had not been accidental, that their pain had not been imaginary, that their loved ones had truly been victims of a terrible injustice. Each family would receive compensation based on the length of exposure, the degree of suffering, and the circumstances of death. It wasn't enough to bring anyone back, but it was justice. Finally, after decades of silence. The most emotional moment of this entire journey occurred on the final day of the main trial, when Harold was called to give his final testimony as a key witness. He walked slowly to the podium, wearing the only suit he owned, bought especially for the occasion, and in his right hand he held something that had become a symbol of this whole story, that rusty key to the warehouse. The same key the manager had handed him with a strange smile, thinking he was simply getting rid of a disposable employee. Harold held that key before everyone, the jury, the lawyers, the families filling the room, the television cameras, broadcasting everything live. And then he spoke, his voice trembling with emotion, but carrying a strength no one would expect from such a humble man. They thought I was invisible, that I would simply walk away and forget, that I didn't matter enough to make a difference. Tears streamed down Harold's wrinkled face as he looked directly at the condemned executives sitting at the other end of the room. But I didn't forget. I couldn't forget, because I remembered the faces. I remembered the names. I remembered the stories of every person on that list, and now, thanks to this key, thanks to these documents, no one will ever forget again. The truth has finally come to light. The entire courtroom erupted in applause. The judge had to bang his gavel several times to restore order, but even he seemed moved. Families of the victims hugged each other, weeping. Journalists scribbled furiously in their notebooks. And Harold, for the first time in his life, was truly seen. Not as the invisible janitor, not as the disposable employee, but as the courageous man who had changed the lives of hundreds of people simply by refusing to let injustice win. If this story deeply touched you, if you believe that courage can come from the most unexpected places, then subscribe to the channel, because Harold's legacy still has a final chapter that will inspire you. And when Harold left that courtroom that day, he was no longer alone. He was surrounded by an entire community that knew it, owed him its right to justice. Today, several years after that Tuesday that changed everything, Harold Jensen continues to live a simple life in Cleveland. He still lives in the same modest apartment, still drives the same old pickup truck, still wakes up early every morning out of pure habit. But something fundamental has changed. Harold is no longer invisible. His name is remembered and respected throughout the city, not as a celebrity or a politician, but as a symbol of courage and justice. People stop him in the street to thank him. Schools invite him to speak to students about ethics and responsibility. Journalists still seek him out when they want to tell stories about ordinary people who have done extraordinary things. And Harold, with his characteristic humility, always says the same thing. I only did what anyone should do. I chose truth over silence. But Harold didn't stop there. Because for him, exposing Whitmore Industrial was never about revenge or becoming famous. It was always about the victims, about ensuring their suffering wasn't in vain. So, with part of the compensation he received as a whistleblower, and with donations from people inspired by his story, Harold created the Jensen Foundation for Occupational Justice, a non-profit organization dedicated to helping workers who have been exposed to toxic substances in their workplaces. The foundation offers free legal support to those who want to sue negligent employers, funds medical treatment for contamination victims who lack resources, and conducts educational campaigns to teach workers about their rights and the signs of dangerous work environments. In just a few years, the foundation has helped more than 200 families throughout the state of Ohio obtain justice and compensation. Harold's story teaches us something profound about the nature of heroism and the impact a single person can have. We live in a world where we often feel too small, too insignificant, too powerless to make a difference. We look at the injustices around us, corporations that exploit workers, systems that protect the powerful, truths that are buried by money and influence, and we think, what can I, just an ordinary person, do about this? Harold's story is the answer. It reminds us that no job is insignificant, that no person is too invisible to matter, and that an ordinary person, armed only with courage and truth, can literally bring down giants. Harold had no money. He had no political connections. He had no college education or special training. He was just a 61-year-old janitor who had been dismissed as irrelevant. But he had something that no amount of money can buy: the willingness to do the right thing, even when it was dangerous, even when it was frightening, even when it would have been much easier to simply look the other way. And that decision, that fundamental choice to put truth above convenience, changed the lives of hundreds of people and inspired thousands of others across the country. The lesson Harold leaves us with isn't just about corporate justice or labor rights, although those things are important. The deeper lesson is about the nature of heroism itself, because Harold proves that sometimes the hero isn't the one with power. It's the one who chooses to do the right thing, even when no one is watching. It's the one who refuses to accept injustice as inevitable. It's the one who remembers names when everyone else has forgotten. It's the one who holds that rusty key and decides to open the door, not knowing what they'll find on the other side, but knowing that the truth deserves to be discovered. And perhaps the most beautiful part of this whole story is this: Harold didn't do all this to be remembered. He did it because it was right. He did it for Miguel, for Sandra, for the 47 names on that list. He did it because someone needed to. And in doing so, he showed us that each of us, no matter how ordinary or invisible we may feel, carries within ourselves the power to change the world. Now let me ask you a question that Harold would ask. And you? What would you do if you discovered a truth that could change lives, but also put yours at risk? Think about it for a second. Would you have Harold's courage? Would you choose the truth, even knowing the consequences? Leave a comment below about what this story evoked in you. And if you made it to the end with me, write below, "I'm with you until the end." I read every comment truly, and I love knowing that there are people on the other side who connect with these stories as much as I do. If this journey touched you in any way, if you felt that pang in your chest when Harold held that rusty key for the first time, or when he decided to do the right thing even though he was afraid, then leave a like below. This simple gesture shows me that it's worthwhile to continue bringing real stories of ordinary people who did extraordinary things. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Click the subscribe button and activate the bell, because I have many other stories like this waiting for you. Stories of courage, of justice, of people who refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. And look, there's a video over here that perfectly complements what we talked about today. It's about another ordinary person who discovered something that should never have been hidden. Click and continue with me there, because the journey doesn't end here. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Thank you for believing that stories like Harold's deserve to be heard. And always remember, courage can be hidden in the most unexpected places. Sometimes it's inside you, just waiting for the right moment to appear. Until next time. And keep doing the right thing even when no one is watching.